All right, here we are. Um, so Tim, maybe you can kind of give a short briefing of who you are, where you're from, what's your story.
Right, so my name is Tim. I'm originally from the Netherlands and I grew up abroad. I'm a proper TCK, third culture kid. Lived abroad, moved back to my home country, um, which is where I got to know Kari during our student days. We studied economics and business, and now I'm here in Finland. Just celebrated Christmas. Looking forward to the new year.
Funny thing, when wherever you're born, you don't get to choose where you're born, who your family is, your parents, siblings, all of that. And what you get to choose is who you associate with, right?
Hmm.
And I remember the first time we met, it was through this Finnish girl that was the only Finnish person besides myself that was doing the whole degree in the Netherlands. And it was a party, and she was invited over, and she said she's gonna bring her boyfriend back in the day. And that was Tim. And funny enough, when you meet somebody for the first time, either there's you kind of associate easily with each other or not. And this with Tim, it was immediately like, yeah, we clicked. So as you might say in 2023, which is closing in right now, it's like it's a bro from another brother from another mother. So and it's kind of been like that, like for what a bunch of years.
24
Yeah, no, that's not total. 22.
22,
Yeah, you're wrong.
2001.
Yeah, you're running upwards. We're in 23 still, man.
My maths are breaking down. Must be the Christmas blues.
And I mean, through the years, we've been having a bunch of topics that we kind of dive into. Um, because there's that intellectual and personal quest of becoming a better version of yourself and to learn more about life, where do we come from, who we are, and where we're going, right? So, is there a particular topic that you have in mind that you want to kind of dive into? Um,
Well, I think that there are so many social topics that we deal with on a daily basis. You said something about becoming a better version of yourself. I think identity plays a major role there. I just mentioned the term TCK, third culture kid. You move from one place to another, you adapt, you improvise, you overcome obstacles. And that's something that we learned doing early on during our studies. In your case, for example, adapting to an environment where you were the only person from your country that you knew. In my case, coming back to my own country and learning to go with the flow of a country that I was originally from, but never lived in. So yeah, that there are a whole bunch of topics in there that we could address.
yeah, I think the self-improvement side, and this is probably something that's going pretty broadly online when it comes to men's communities generally, or the male experience, is it's not really a choice. A man needs to self-improve and every day kind of look to be the best version of himself. Women do have the luxury of just kind of being themselves, looking pretty, and that's it. Obviously, if they have ambitions, careers, etc., they need to educate them, they need to work hard, sure. But generally speaking, it's more elective. A dude that says like, "Oh, you should accept me the way I am because I'm beautiful, although I might be, broke and overweight." It's like nobody's gonna take that seriously.
No,
But in
no.
today's culture, if you're a female and you haven't done anything with your life, you're not even taking great care of yourself, but you still say like, "I'm a queen." People are clapping their hands, being like, "Yeah, go queen." But I don't know what part of I would say the growth and self improvement journey do you find on the one hand most rewarding and perhaps on the other hand most challenging?
Well, I think that on the challenges side, let's say, there's, I think the idea is that you have to persevere through times that are perhaps more challenging. You have to solve problems, and overcome them. And that's not always an easy process. I find that in our studies, there have been numerous moments where um, there are pitfalls that I did not know how to exactly solve. And now I look back and I think, oh, hindsight is 2020. I would have solved it this way had I had the knowledge that I have today. So yeah, I think that um, early on during the studies and also as a kid moving around in my personal experience, um, I had to take some decisions and stand behind those decisions, and that's what it's really about: is choosing a particular path, choosing a goal, focusing on it, and moving with a purpose.
Um, when I think back of those 4 years I did in the Netherlands in terms of a degree,
Hmm.
um, although on paper I had finished all the courses, I didn't finish my thesis, and I was still going on statistics one and mathematics one.
Mm.
And that seemed to be the impediment, really, on paper. But the reality is, there was just kind of a mental block there in the beginning, because I did a year of military service in Finland, right?
Yeah.
And when you do military service, you can really put your brains on the freezer. You just follow orders and you do what you're supposed to do.
It's compulsory in Finland, right?
Yeah, yeah, you have to do minimum 6 months. But I wanted to be training the new recruits of the next batch. And I found that as being one of the best experiences I could have had at 19 years old. Like you get a bunch of guys, like 40 guys who are civilians, and I've done 6 months of training. And my job is basically to turn them into skilled soldiers,
Yeah.
able to defend the country. So how do you transition a normal civilian 18, 19, 20-year-old kid to a soldier?
Yeah.
Like, sure, I had the blueprint, I knew what I'm supposed to do. But when you're standing in front of these guys and they're looking at you like, who the hell do you think you are? You're a soldier boy, whatever. Like, how do you kind of make contact with them? You're, on the one hand, you're a human being, but on the other hand, you have a job to do, which is to train these civilians into soldiers.
Yeah.
Like, where do you, in terms of, let's say, leadership, where do you place yourself on the scale of I'm your bro, but I'm also your boss?
Yeah.
Because if you're just a cold-hearted boss that just has a whiplash on their backs, it's not really gonna work. But if you're their bro, you got no authority, no respect. And when you're a 19-year-old kid who's unprepared psychologically for this, what I found quite interesting is we went through the same training with all the guys, but when the recruits came in, the reactions of how the different guys approached this situation was wildly different. And I thought that's kind of a great psychological experiment. And what happened in my case is I knew I want to turn these guys into soldiers. So I have to be pretty demanding, strict, and but at the same time be fair and not be an asshole basically. Because what I had in when I was a recruit, we had a bunch of these guys who were training us. And one in particular, he was a jacked up dude, right? And he had a loud voice, but he was a bit of a short of a dude. Maybe like 165 tall, but it was a good looking face in the dude and jacked and like pretty like hardcore. Um, and he was promoted after training the recruits. I was like, okay, maybe these barracks or this type of style is rewarded. So I might as well kind of go with the same type of approach. Like be tough, be demanding, be like don't mess around with me, right? And put them through a little bit more, let's say, physically demanding tasks than absolutely necessary from the training perspective.
Hmm.
But at the same time, not being an asshole and just being fair.
So having a balanced approach, basically.
Exactly. And when I did that, there's always, it's kind of like the first time I was doing presentations at work. That was 30 years old back then, in front of 200 people with like probably 25 PhDs or 50 years old who know a ton more about the topic than I did.
Hmm.
The moment when I had to stand in front of the audience and before I opened my mouth, that's when I was sweating, like psychologically. But when I opened my mouth, I start talking. I'm like, okay, I still sound the same. So there was a soothing, like a calm demeanor that came. I'm like, all right, all right, it's not that bad.
And how do you feel that your military training and that experience of providing leadership influenced your time in Tilburg during the studies?
Well, this is kind of where I'm getting into is
Hmm.
my approach to training those recruits was that I was demanding, I was tough, but I was fair. In the first, it's like 2 months basic training. In the beginning, the guys, the civilians were like, what is this guy about? He's being strict and he's this and that and he's giving
Hmm.
us instructions. Like, dude, chill. And I was looking at them like, bro, you're in the military. Like, stop acting like a bitch, right? I
Yeah.
give you an order, you follow that order. It's non-negotiable. You do that with a calm demeanor. You're being fair, but you're extremely articulate. And then these civilians, they have to choose between like, okay, he's giving us an order. I guess we have to follow it, but what?
Yeah.
And there's that tipping
Yeah.
point, and there's the majority of them understood. Now you're in the military, you follow orders, and they were like, some were like kind of grinding their teeth and be like, oh, fucking hell. And a couple of them were starting to talk back, kind of test the limits. Like, am I actually for real, or is this just a facade? And when they were challenging the order, I was like, bro, really?
You gotta take this seriously.
And the beauty of it is that that's testing your basically your spine. You got 40 guys looking at you and one who's got the balls to challenge you. How do you deal with that? Because
Well,
you don't hold the line, you're going to embarrass yourself for good in front of those 40 guys. How are you being articulate, fair, but you give the order in a sense of like, bro, don't mess around with this?
I have to think of Gunnery Sergeant Hartman in Full Metal Jacket.
Exactly.
Is this me? Is this John Wayne?
So that experience, I knew already that in the first 6, 7 weeks of
Yeah.
basic training, most of the recruits thought that I was the asshole, right?
Mm.
Because I was always a bit tougher than the rest. I was more demanding, etc. But they didn't see the forest from the trees. Because then towards the end of the recruit period, you had a bunch of different tests, right? Especially the physically more demanding tests. And the guys that I was training, they did better than the average. And then once they graduated from being recruits, the bottom of the barrel, several of them, I would probably think the kind of the more versed guys, they came to me and said, hey, we thought all along that you were a bit of an asshole, but now we realize there was actually a point to
It's okay, it happens to the best.
that. But that as an experience, I was extremely proud of myself for having done that at 19 years old.
Yeah.
Um, and then I was watching the other guys who were training. Some of them were more sloppy. Some of them were being bros to the recruits, like befriending them, and not being able to take that balance between be fair but still maintain authority, etc. So as a growth, I would say psychological growth spurt, the ability to train these recruits, I think that was one of the best experiences I had in my life
Yeah.
on a personal growth level. How did that translate when I moved to the Netherlands to study? Suddenly I had to pick up books and start proactively read. Nobody's there to give me a schedule. So it was hard in the beginning.
Yeah.
Not to mention that I lived in the same apartment block with the exchange students
A
that
bunch
were
of lunatics.
they partied every single day. And I was like, okay, maybe this is student life. Okay, maybe I open a book now and again, but it's more party time.
Yeah.
And it's yeah, it's kind of took me a year and a half of pretty hardcore partying before I woke up. I'm like, oh man, maybe I should actually pass those exams too.
Yeah.
But I don't know,
Well,
how was it for you?
well, actually, I was thinking just as you were explaining about your experience in the military, training recruits and building character. I found that, and I'm going to maybe discuss my personal experience later. I found that the people that did military service, primarily, for example, in your case, from Finland, but also our German colleagues, German students that came to Tilburg to study a year. A lot of them came uh, exactly the year after me and the year after that. A lot of Germans who did military service first or social service in Germany. You have both options. Um,
Oh, you mean civilian service?
sorry,
Here
civilian
you have it
service.
as well.
You can choose to do it instead of the military.
Yeah, and there's especially with the older generation here,
Hmm.
there's a bit of a stigma. Like if you're a man, you do military
You do the
service.
military service.
If you're unsure about your, whether what kind of equipment you have down there, then you might consider civilian service. Now,
Yeah.
nowadays, when you've got more kids that are overweight and out of shape and playing video games, the percentage of let's say 18, 19, 20 year old of guys who are unwilling or unable to actually perform the basic
Hmm.
training is dropped down because the health of kids nowadays is a lot worse than before.
Yeah.
Anyways, go on.
Yeah. No, it's good to note. That's perhaps something to touch upon later, social trends of the
Yeah.
last 20 years. But I found that these German students were better able to deal with the transition towards student life than, in any case, a lot of the Dutch people that I saw, and also people that generally didn't do any kind of training, any kind of military or civilian training, where you need to carry out tasks that are pretty much selfless. Um, I had the same during my international school experience in Brussels. We had to do a lot of, let's say, voluntary work or volunteer work, I should say. I did my time in Brussels in a kitchen, cleaning dishes and drying them in a kitchen in the center of Brussels. Not exactly the same, but it was compulsory. And if you look at what it's like being a student and that time when we met, I found the challenge I found a big challenge in creating a routine, finding the right approach to your studies, and also socially adapting to your environments. I found that a lot of the German students they had ants more discipline overall, and they helped each other out. There was a sense of camaraderie, um, and I think that turning back to the idea of going through something like that before your studies, it's very beneficial. And if you have a position of leadership, as you did, for example, training recruits, um, it gives you a sense of idea or an idea of the sense of having a goal and a strategy to pursue it. Now, that all sounds rather serious. I think that it's also important to relax and chill and party for a while, but knowing in the back of your mind that there is a strategy and a structure you need to stick to ultimately to be successful.
Would you have preferred that after high school you would have been required to do military service
I would
before
not
that?
have minded. Yeah, I would have applauded that. Military service was disbanded a year before it. So I started in 1997, um, and the year before that, so 96, military service was disbanded in the Netherlands. Um, so actually, yeah, I if I look back,
You mean country?
conscri- yeah, conscription, yeah, compulsory military service was up to 96 or maybe even 95. I'm not sure now. But in any case, the mid 90s, and I started in 1997. When I look back, I would gladly, um, yeah, I'd say, exchanging a year of the 3 years it took me to adapt to the Netherlands, to the environment. I would gladly exchange one of those years for military service. Yeah, but at the same time, my homecoming, let's say, and the time it took me to adapt to the Netherlands psychologically, um, dealing with not just student life, but coming back to your own country with certain expectations and an idea of what your country is like, and being and disappointed, but also discovering things that you didn't know existed. So positive surprises, let's say, that are also part of the student life. That was my story, and that was a psychological challenge that ultimately helped me out with my future challenges after that. the challenges that were to come after. So yeah, I think there are many ways to row.
Yeah, I mean the way you describe it, what I had as well is every time we went abroad and came back. In our case, it was always like going to Brussels and then going back. We did that 4 different times.
What did your parents do for a living?
My dad worked for a government-owned bank
Mm-hmm.
that had a representative office in Brussels, and we moved there in 1990 in December the first time. Supposed to be there for a year, but then towards the end of the year, they asked him to extend that for another year, and then they established a new office of that bank in the region where we're right now,
Mm-hmm.
where my dad was born in, and they asked him to actually set it up and hire the people and get it going. So that's what we did. But then towards the end of '94, we had the referendum. Finland joined the European Union. They said we definitely now need a representative office in Brussels, and he already had the experience for 2 years, and my dad spoke French. So they said, "Do you want to go?"
Yeah.
And we left. So that was another 3.5 years. And what you said about volunteer work, that's part of the curriculum in the IB,
Yeah.
International Baccalaureate.
Correct.
And I did the same thing too because it's just a mandatory part of it.
Yeah.
I think it's a good part of it for sure. And not to mention that when you graduate with that sort of diploma, you can apply anywhere. Um, but it was not as common back then as it is right now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, so I think when it comes to going abroad, and in this context, it generally means that one of your parents or both, mostly one of your parents, they do that for work. But their work generally is, I would say, relatively highly skilled work,
Mm-hmm.
which means that you have a bunch of benefits in terms of you're making decent money, you got tax breaks, the employer is paying for your residence, all of this funky stuff, and the employer is generally paying for private schools for the kids.
Yeah, that's a
So
huge plus.
So this is something that, in terms of context, means that for the family, generally for the wife and the kids,
Yeah.
they are living a rather comfortable existence when they're abroad. So from that sort of an existence where you're basically getting to know different cultures, languages, but you always like you have a cushioned life because your father is doing pretty well
Mm-hmm.
professionally. Then from that going back to your original country of birth, right? And where you used to, it seems like a very anticlimactic um, event.
Yeah, you could say
So the way you describe it is, I feel the same way every single time we came back. It seemed like now it's an anticlimax because you come to something familiar, easy. There's no challenges. There's nothing really to learn per se. And I think understanding that in the point of view of somebody who's never lived abroad, it's kind of difficult.
that.
But kids and young adults who've lived abroad, they kind of get it more because it's ingrained. But that's a shared experience we both have, and that's why it's easier to understand each other in that sense.
Yeah.
And I had it 3 times. First time we came back, second time we came back, and once I graduated, I came back here. Um, and every time it was the same. I was a bit homesick, but I was like, what the hell am I doing here?
Yeah.
It's the anticlimax of the decade. But then you ask yourself, okay, this is the anticlimax, but do I try to kind of fit in somehow, or
Yeah.
do I want to go back? And then it's like, maybe I'll try to, you know, find my own place here. And I had it again when I was in Brussels 2015 and 20 for another
Mm-hmm.
5 years. And now it's been,
Were you there for that long?
yeah, yeah. And but that was the first time that I did that professionally.
Yeah.
And now it's been back like 3.5 years. And is there a desire to go somewhere? I'd be open to it, but there's not really a desire. It's been 15 years abroad, right? It's like you've been now in the Netherlands for how long?
Well, it's interesting that you bring this up because I have exactly the same in the sense that I lived abroad much of my life.
Okay.
Actually, well, of the so prior to my turning 18, prior to the studies, I lived actually 2 years in The Hague, but I went to a French school, so I don't count that as being in the Netherlands, although physically, yes, geographically, perhaps. But afterwards, after my studies, I did my dissertation in another city called Groningen, and then I moved to The Hague to finish that dissertation. Not long after that, I moved to the Middle East to work in Saudi Arabia for 3.5 years. I coincidentally lived there as a kid as well. Um, so those were 3.5 years of the years that I've been in the Netherlands after 18. So my adult years, let's say, I lived 3.5 years in the Middle East, and the rest I spent actually in the Netherlands. Of course, I traveled this and that and the other, especially for work, but mostly building a base just like you here back in Finland. I did the same in the Netherlands and don't really feel the urge to move to, you name it, a big world city like New York or just to name a place like that, that everybody would love to live in, or Singapore or London or Paris. Great places to visit every so now and then, I'm sure, but I don't feel that urge anymore to have to go out of the go out of my way to be abroad, which is paradoxical because um, I do have my issues with being back in my home country, yet there are other things that I appreciate, and I appreciate those things enough to stay where I am and continue focusing on building that base. That's part of the TCK Third Culture Kid Challenge is to make amends with the fact that you grew up differently than others around you. And then there are so many shades of gray, right? I mean, there are people who grew up abroad and stay abroad. They study abroad and they completely estrange themselves from the country they come from. And in your case, as in mine, we come back and we build a base, physical, mental, financial base, perhaps in the future a family base, who knows? But those are kind of the elements of the equation, I would say that we're working on. So yeah, I I have to say it's interesting that you bring that up because we didn't talk about that much, right? The idea of coming back to your own country and staying put, not feeling the urge to really move around all the time again,
Yeah, and this is
because it's sort of like without wanting to sound blasé, but it's been there, done that, and gotten the t-shirt.
so, but this is also something that is not necessarily one of the more interesting topics to discuss when you have limited time. But when I hear people who are like 20 or 25 or 30, and they're like, "Oh, I want to travel, I want to explore, I want to see the
Hmm.
world, I want to." My dream this year is to move abroad and like have an exciting, adventurous time. To me, it seems like, yeah, okay, what you're saying between the lines is you've lived in one place,
Hmm.
most likely, your whole life. It's been somewhat boring. You're not getting ahead in life. And you're like, "Ah," it's like water that's standing still.
Yeah,
And you see the moss coming. You're like, I need to move. I need to get out there.
getting the itch.
Right. And you know the only way to scratch it is go around, like, whether it's riding the carousel or just traveling the world. But so when I hear that, I'm like, okay, what you're saying is one thing, but the omission part is where I'm reading really like, okay, you haven't had that experience.
Yeah.
Because people who say, well, I don't really feel the urge or the need to go out there and see the world, it's either because you're so timid or your, let's say, your comfort level or your safety level, you want to be in a small box, a
Yeah.
sandbox, because you can't tolerate going outside of it for more than a week to, let's say, to Spain or Greece for holidays. Then you're like, oh, I'm so happy to go back home. Or in our case, it's like you've already done that.
Yeah.
There's nothing left to prove. Um, so yeah, that's something that is very difficult to explain unless you've actually been through that. And when you mention people who actually move abroad, we could name a bunch of those.
Yeah.
And then they move abroad and they stay. It's just like they're disowning their country of origin or
Yeah.
their culture of origin. And I always had a bit of a hard time understanding that unless you include that perhaps where they come from, not necessarily the country, culture, religion, whatever, but more like their childhood family background. That's something that they want to distance themselves from.
Yeah.
And that would be a great explaining factor. Is like they got nothing really to go back to. That's why anything else is better, right?
Yeah.
So I tend to look at these people who've just moved to a different culture, place, etc. They want to recreate their life from scratch. I'm like, there's probably some sort of laundry that you either should have done or you should do, because running away from a bad situation is not really a solution. It might make life easier, but it's not a solution. It's like if you have a problem, you start moving countries, you think you can run away and you leave the problem behind.
Yeah.
No, the problem is here.
Mental.
Exactly. And so in that sense, and I'm not saying it's just a one size fits all that everybody who moves to, like I understand. Let's say you're from a troubled country that has civil war, repression, whatever. You move, you migrate because your life is crap in the country. I understand. Then you want to settle to a better country. But I mean, when you move in countries where there's not really a clear, like let's say, advantage in terms of opportunity or higher salaries or etc. Um, essentially, because migration through history is driven predominantly by economic opportunity,
Push and pull factors.
right? So if you can work a job X in your country of origin and you can make $1,000 salary per month, but then in the country that's 3,000 kilometers that way, doing the same job, you can triple your salary. Would you want to move?
Mm.
I think the incentive is big enough for you to say, let me give it a shot because I can have such a better life in that country, especially if the country provides social security, if the country provides a certain level of people from your same background as you are. So, kind of moving in and settling in is made easier. Um, as well as you can always go back, right?
Yeah.
Or you can go there, work for a bunch of years, and then you save up money and you go back and you live it off. I mean, that I can understand. But then we can obviously segue with this introduction to one of the more hot topics of the day, which is migration, right?
Yeah, of course.
And the reasons for migration, like, and anybody who studies it a little bit understands that it's really the economic opportunity.
Yeah.
The refugee side of it, it tends to be secondary. But then I think the big difference is both countries, if migration is done right, both countries benefit. But if it's done wrong, yeah, especially the country that takes in the migrant, they're the one that is losing out. For example, you lived in the Middle East. Um, in the Middle East, especially in the Gulf region, there's a bunch of expats and migrant workers. The high paid ones, the low paid ones. But the clear difference is that their way to treat the guest workers and migrants and expats is extremely different than what we have in the so-called West.
Yeah.
They're never given citizenship. They commit any crimes, they get kicked out, and
If
they
they're
get back.
lucky.
Exactly. So, I mean, obviously, when you were in the Middle East, you were one of these expats, or you were these skilled people that they need because they don't have those skilled people from their own population, generally speaking. Now, when you compare the let's say the migrant or guest worker experience, kind of the reverse of what we're used to hearing,
Mm.
which is people from the Middle East or Africa in this case that come over to Europe or the US. But then they settle, they want to get the nationality and they want to get all the benefits and the goodies that come with it. But how was your experience if you're going to contrast that to the general wave of migration that's heading from the poor countries to the rich ones?
Um, First of all, I'd like to say that at the root is this economic incentive to better your life. And in that sense, everybody on this planet is the same. We all want to improve our lives. It is true that um, the migration crisis in Europe has a political edge to it that is controversial and has a lot of different impacts on society. But I'd like to go back to the basics and make everybody equal. Let's say in the sense that me moving to Middle East, looking to better my life, is very similar to someone moving from another part of the world to another part of the world, or to, in this case, Europe where we live, or look at the U.S. U.S. is built on successful in the past successful immigration. It's built on immigrants. We can't really compare that long-term immigration, though, because I said we're all human, right? But the process of being in the Middle East, in this particular case, whether you're from Bangladesh on the one hand, doing low skilled work, quote unquote low skilled, it's also a feat to clean the streets in a Middle Eastern country in 50 degrees Celsius heat for several months at a time. So I'd like to make sure that people understand that it's the same challenge as um, of moving to such a part of the world, coming from, in this case, Bangladesh, in my example, as a European is moving to that part of the world with other constraints, with other challenges to deal with. There are many overlaps, I would say, for any person that moves to the Middle East, or for any person that moves to another part of the world that he or she is not really used to being in, or is a foreigner to. There are always challenges. In my case, I could say that um, the challenge is especially um, living in that geographic climatic environment, different religious practices, and also having to adapt to local customs and local ways of doing things, and especially organizationally different way of doing things than back home, is certainly a really um, big challenge that I experienced. And I feel that in European countries, people often take the liberties for granted that they have, and uh, immigration, just as you said, when it's done wrong, when it takes place too quickly, it's no longer the same model that we have in the US or in Europe in earlier times. Europe has also seen its um, mass movements of people over the centuries. And the United States is only 200, well, you name it, since the American Revolution. It's a very young country, which since then is again built on immigrants. So there's nothing wrong with migration. Um, Coming back to my own personal experience, I was certainly, and none of the so called expats, let's call everybody guest workers. I'm a guest worker, the Bangladeshi cleaning the streets, and let's not mince words. That's exactly what happens. Facts don't care about your feelings. Um, just saying, calling a spade, that's exactly how things work in the Middle East. In most Gulf countries, there's a difference between uh, the Middle East, North Africa, Middle East, non-Gulf, and then the Gulf countries, which are the countries that can afford, um, yeah, afford basically to import both knowledge and high-skilled work and low-skill labor, all in the form of guest workers. We are all guests in those countries. And in those countries, we adapt, we improvise, we overcome. I come back to those terms because that's at the end of the day what it's about. That's how I feel that we should all look at it, no matter where we come from. And it's different when you go to the. I saw my time in the Middle East as sort of like a mission, a temporary mission to go there, gain experience, enjoy some financial benefits that I would not normally be able to enjoy in my home country, in the Netherlands in this case, or elsewhere in Europe for that matter.
Which means like zero taxation and stuff.
Yes, correct. But conversely, there were several other financial benefits that I would say are not disproportional to the salary. Um, but the challenge that you have there, or the flip side of that coin, is that you don't have any social security. You are to take care of your own pension plans. Human as a no matter whether you're a Bangladeshi or a white European guest worker. I'm gonna not stick to the term expat and not to the because in a video that I recently watched about Dubai, expats are supposedly European or American or Australian, especially white people who go to the Middle East and are doing high skilled or highly educated work, so to speak, and people who come from many other countries in the world, no matter what they look like, whether they're purple, yellow, or orange, get treated in a different discriminatory manner, but are, in my view, also guest workers. Everybody there is a guest. Even other Arab countries have people go to the Gulf countries and are dealt with as guest workers, all equal in front, or not in front, but in the lay of the land. So it's all for everyone who comes there, every person who seeks to better his or her life, at least temporarily, it's a temporary mission. It's a temporary, so it's not immigration, it's not migration, it's a temporary displacement of oneself before the person um, of all walks of life, and also enough single women go to the Middle East to work as nurses or secretaries. Unfortunately, not often in leadership positions. It's perhaps another a topic for another day to say that if we so appreciate equal rights and gender rights, then maybe those values should be extolled in those countries as well. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So, coming back to the overall topic of bettering one's life and moving to one place or another, it is important to adapt, improvise, and overcome. And I believe that those improvisation techniques and skills and abilities are often not um, lived up to by many people who move to Western countries, unfortunately. And again, we call a spade a spade.
Well, on the topic of adaptation, um, integration is potentially, in your case, a bit of a strong word because it's not like you go there as a guest worker to convert to Islam and learn Arabic, etc.
No.
Because you're a guest worker there for X amount of years and then you leave. Um, but what you just last said there, which concerns adaptation integration, is because the approach to guest workers or foreigners in the country, in let's say the Gulf states
Yeah.
and Europe and the US, is wildly different. When you've got people from, let's say, the Middle East and Africa moving to Europe or the US, they don't come here as guest workers. And the problem, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, when you go to the Middle East to be a guest worker, regardless if you're a skilled guest worker that makes a bunch of money, your adaptation slash integration is not voluntary. If you choose to go against the grain of what the law of the land is and the culture, there's going to be immediate and harsh repercussions,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
So it's not really like, oh, I feel like integrating or not.
It's not a level playing field.
Exactly. But when you get into that boat, you're like, okay, I understand that's the name of the game, right?
Yeah.
You don't go there and say, oh, I claim the same rights as the native population who've got the passport.
Yeah.
Or you can try, but we all know what happens if you do. But then the opposite situation is actually true in the West. You come from whatever part of the world, as long as you cross the border, you say asylum, And or if you do that legally, even not by through dodgy means, give it 5 years. You claim the passport. You claim social security when you have a residence permit, if you're a refugee or if you're a guest worker, whatever. But once you get into the country, especially legally, you can stay forever. You can
Yeah.
claim all the benefits and the rights. You can go out there and go against the grain. If there's enough of people that are like-minded as you can even try your best to change the regulations, laws, and the culture of the country. And nobody's really stopping.
Yeah.
You can go out there and protest, demonstrate, run your mouth. And integration has become a voluntary part of migration. And I find that to be the core problem
Yeah.
because it's not a sheer accident that in the West, broadly speaking, we have the most successful societies on the planet, right?
Yeah.
Why do I say that? Why is it essentially true? For the very simple reason as look at the flow of migration.
Yeah.
Everybody agrees, and the research is agrees on it, that it's economic opportunity that makes people migrate. The flows of migration are predominantly going from the so-called third world countries to the first world countries. And the West is basically
It's
the torchbearer of the first world countries. So when people voluntarily want to move there,
hmm
regardless of what the mainstream says, oh, but these countries are so toxic, misogynist, racist. I mean, all these kind of buzzwords. Yet all the people want to come here,
hmm
and there is just a voluntary. Oh, we'll tell you about our customs and rules and laws, so that you know what's happening here. But if you don't follow them, it's okay. We'll provide you a place in the penitentiary, which is actually a three-star hotel. So there is not really an enforcement system of saying you need to integrate, because if you don't, you're out. Go to the Gulf countries. If you don't adapt to their rules, they put you in jail, and it's not a three-star hotel, and they kick you out. So, like you said, it's like it's not a question of whether you feel like doing it or not.
hmm
And we've made, I think, the progress that we made in this, let's say, side of humanism in our societies, it's great. But now it's starting to defeat its purpose. It's we all know what the road to hell is paved with,
Good intentions.
right? And I think the intentions are good, but if there's no requirement,
Yeah.
it's just like the current culture of when you have a sports event and the kids from school participate, everybody should get a participation trophy so that they don't feel bad for not winning or getting second or third place. And then they might cry. If we teach kids that you need to merit what you get, you need to work for it. If you're good, you get rewarded. To kind of instill to them the core tenet of why we're so successful and developed, which is meritocracy. May the best man win, right?
Yeah.
And if
Work
you're the
hard.
best, exactly. And then it is by default in a meritocracy that the people who reach the pinnacle because of their merits. I mean, I'm not saying it's perfect, like everybody who's meriting gets to the top, but they get a disproportionate amount of money, success, and fame as a result. We should not be butthurt about it. What we should be butthurt about, if we have a system where the less able and less merited and less deserving people are at the top,
Yeah.
because we know then they're running things to the ground, right?
Yeah. But
We don't even have to point fingers at those countries that run a very kleptocratic, corrupt,
but
authoritarian system that
but
is not benefiting the population, right?
but I think you have to think also of the north-south divide,
Sure.
um, because there are a whole bunch of nuances and shades of gray when it comes to um, different countries having migration issues. If you look at Australia, for example, Australia has the same policy as the Gulf countries, not on a one-to-one basis, but they are very strict with who manages to come in and who manages or has the ability to take part in society. I think I was just reading an article the other day about the Australian dream and how it's collapsing because of higher housing prices and unemployment issues. So also not perfect. There is no such thing as a perfect society. There's no utopia. Um, but then, you
Until
know,
they do communism right.
exactly, yeah. If only communism worked in practice. But no, a lot of things are great on paper, but they don't work in practice. Yeah, exactly. But I think Australia, for example, from what I know, I've never been there, but what I've read about it,
We might
um,
want to change that.
yeah, we might want to. Yes, yes, we will. Actually, a common friend of ours lives there. So, yeah, I think that Australia has a very good model. They have a quote, or they have a motto that says, "You will not make Australia your home." That means unless you really fully integrate. And that's a very contentious topic. It's very controversial in Europe. It's a very thorny issue. But if everyone, we were talking about people who grew up here in Europe or in a place in the world and never moved around and never had to deal with such challenges of adapting and improvising and doing so in a successful way, whether they came back to their home country or not. Um, I think that that's really what it boils down to is the ability to do so successfully. Um, and Australia, I think, is a good example of where you're really, in a way, forced to adapt. And that's something that if in European countries the mentality is different. They don't have the Australian mentality because um, they are not immigrants themselves. They grew up here. Let's say the indigenous European person grew up in Europe, never had to really. Those Europeans that did not have to move around in modern times will maybe be more complacent. Whereas if all of them had gone through that experience, just like you and me and many others out there, that so many friends of mine and former colleagues that I know have moved around and had to go through the same challenges. If everyone had that in the back of their minds and part of their DNA, they would be more like the Aussies. And for whatever reason, historically, that the Aussies are the way they are, it's I think, a much more successful approach to integration and immigration.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, when we look at, for example, the migration flows from Europe to the US, the old world versus the new world.
In the early 20th century, 19th century.
I mean, even if we look at the, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries,
Mm,
um, I mean, North America was basically empty. You just had some indigenous tribes there, right? And then you started to have European, because the Catholic Church had a reasonably strong grip on power. Countries were autocratic, run by
mhm,
kings or despots or whatever. People wanted freedom, right? So the only opportunity to get the economic freedom and, let's say, political and religious freedom was to move to the new continent. So the people who had, and this I think partially applies to the migrant flows from, let's say, Africa, Middle East to Europe. It's the young men that are the strongest, most adventurous in spirit, and who would potentially realize the most potential in their new country. Those are the ones who dare to do that
mhm.
journey, especially when it's illegal. But it was legal from Europe to the US most of the time. And then you had just a vast continent that you can just go there and be the pioneer and claim your land and start farming and doing whatever. So I think the people, or I could be wrong, but the people with the most innovative and adventurous spirits were the early movers, right?
Yeah.
And they could make a new life, which is more free and less restricted. You didn't have old aristocratic families, like these stiff structures of society, that if you were born in the wrong place, wrong family, etc., your economic opportunity was very limited. And so essentially that freedom and the vast expansive spaces in the US, North America, as well as not having a structure where there was a bunch of population already there. Like,
Hmm.
let's look at the Spaniards going to Mexico or South America. They realized like there's a plenty of local population here. And then they created a structure whereby the conquistadores, they had in Mexico, they had the encomienda. It's like serfdom. It's like almost like slavery. So the native, the indigenous, they suddenly became slaves because the conquistadores said, okay, we actually own the land, and now you guys need to work the land for our benefit.
Yeah.
But with the Native Americans, the Indians, they were not. The structure was different. You didn't have civilizations there. These were nomads going back and forth, and it's not like the whites enslaved and made the Indians work the land. That didn't really happen at all. So that's why, I mean, the structure of society in the US was based on work, tolling, and labor, that you actually have to work on your own success, not just have a bit more modern weapons. Then you see a bunch of local people that you can just say, oh, well, I'll enslave you, you work the land, I'll chill, and I'll pick up the money. And then you get to modern times when you have this almost like a caste system whereby a couple of 100 years ago there was a dude from Spain who came over, he took the land,
A dude from
and
Spain.
now it's like sixth or seventh generation and they're multimillionaires.
Yeah.
And then you got the mestizos or whatever, and they're like, well, I gotta bust my balls to actually get somewhere in life, and still, kind of breaking that system to have it as a meritocracy that's not corrupt, that's transparent and fair, etc. It's a very difficult thing to try to accomplish. And that's really, as I perceive it, to be the great difference between North America and Latin America. The lack of populations that you can enslave and their resources, gold, etc. So you have to work the land. You had to create something yourself. And that means everybody gets a vote. Now, here, somebody might say, oh, well, the women didn't get the vote in the US until the 20th century. To which I might add, yes. But what is the big difference? Why there was a big movement in the US against female voting rights?
Go ahead.
If you had the voting rights, you also had the responsibility of defending the country, which is conscription. And this is something that when you talk about gender rights
Mm.
in a country like Finland, the one, how would you say, elephant in the room is when women say, ah, there's, patriarchy and women should have quotas in the boards of publicly listed companies, management teams and boards, and you should have quotas for women for this, that, and the other. They always seem to conveniently forget, like, okay, here we have conscription, but it only applies if you have an XY chromosome
Yeah.
and you identify as a man, right? So you don't get to, change your sex,
What
your
about?
gender.
What if you're binary?
I mean, here they passed the previous government, which was they had five-party government, and all the chair people were women, and
Mm.
that was a leftish government. They passed a law whereby you can change your gender once a year without any proof, any evidence. So you can just say,
Really?
"Oh, I feel like a woman today." Then you just send in the application to the registry, and you're a woman.
That is ridiculous.
But this is the kind of level of progress that we've
Yeah.
come to. But this is kind of one of the reasons why it's very conveniently forgotten about, that the right to vote often came with a responsibility, because you cannot have rights without somebody having the responsibility. So if you have the right to vote, generally speaking, it comes with a responsibility of conscription. And if that was the deal today, I bet the majority of women would say, I don't want to vote because I don't want to be conscripted. I don't want to go bleed in the meat grinder if there's a war.
Yeah.
But then, if you have a country like Finland that has got conscription,
Rights and privileges.
exactly, and the problem is a lot of times that people talk about rights, 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 but you cannot have rights without somebody being responsible for enforcing them.
Yeah.
And this is a hot topic as well. I don't know if you agree or not.
I
The
disagree.
Okay, that's a quick one.
Yeah.
Oh, you read minds, so then great. You must have
I
some
have
special
telepathic
ability.
ability.
Yeah. So somebody said this recently, that all the rights of women in the West exist only because men enforce them.
Yeah.
Now
I
roll
agree
that
with that.
back a little bit. Let's say equal rights that women possess in the West. If men would not enforce them, do you think women could enforce them? Because when we talk about enforcement, we're talking about the monopoly of violence that states have,
Yeah.
which is the police and the military. Now, when you look at who is working for the police and the military, I would say it's overwhelmingly men because they have the physical capability to actually go and enforce the will of the state. That's then obviously you've got the division of power. Um, so the rights of women, sure, they're voting in parliament, but what the hell are you going to do with the law or regulation unless you have the capacity to widely enforce it?
Hmm.
And somebody needs to enforce it. Now it's men, maybe it's in the future it's going to be robots, but women cannot enforce their rights. So isn't that interesting?
It's a luxury.
Absolutely. And this is another thing, which is masculinity and masculine traits are a prerequisite to
A,
be able
s-
to operate in the world.
a successful society.
Femininity is a luxury because being responsible, toiling, going through adversity, putting food on the table, those are all traits that are inherently masculine.
Yeah.
But femininity, nurturing, taking care, etc., that is a luxury that you cannot afford unless you have the masculinity as a basis, right?
It's a chicken and egg story.
Right. But then yet when you ask women, um, let's say not publicly, because publicly they might be parroting the mainstream narrative. Would they prefer to grind 60 hours a week in a corporate job or whatever job, being an electrician, oil rig worker, whatever? Funny enough, electricians, plumbers, garbage collectors, oil rig workers, nobody's asking for a female quota there. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Because I thought they all want equality.
So do the same thing as men.
Exactly. But then when it comes to positions of financial success, power, etc., then suddenly like, oh, but it's
Yeah.
patriarchy. Here we can segue into the other uncomfortable topic, which is it's been widely researched in psychology that when you test the IQs of people, men and women in this case, the distribution of the IQs for men is broader than for women. In layman speak, it is statistically proven that the most intelligent people on the planet are overwhelmingly men. And as we know, IQ and intelligence is the primary attribute in terms of reaching socioeconomic success, which means running companies, making money, getting Nobel Prizes. But at the same token, the least intelligent people on the planet are overwhelmingly men. And when you test the IQs of inmate populations, their IQs are pretty low
Yeah.
for the very simple reason that if you're low on IQ and you play by the society's rules, you're always losing, right? And you realize that early on in your life. So the only way for you to get respect, succeed in any sort of way, shape, or form is break the rules. But when you're low IQ, you cannot play by the rules because you lose, you get nowhere, you break the rules. Sooner or later, you're going to get caught.
Yeah.
And then you end up in jail. So it's not a blanket statement that all inmates are dumbasses, but it's more prevalent there. And because men are more aggressive, thanks to testosterone, it's not our nature. It's we're slaves to our hormones. Our sex drive and our aggression comes from the 14 to 17 times higher production of testosterone than women. So women say, well, we've got periods, so that's why we're volatile psychologically, at least once a month. Men say the same thing. We're slaves to our hormonal system because it's not us. We're all nice and goody two shoes, but it's testosterone. That's why we're a bit more aggressive, and that's why we have a sex drive. But anyway, so publicly, you cannot necessarily state that the distribution of IQ for men is wider than women. So there's a very small proportion of women that are at the top 1%. But equally, the prison population is 90% plus men versus women because women are less aggressive, less stupid, etc. And then you look at the homeless population globally. What proportion do you think of the homeless let's say in the West, are men versus women?
I think it's men.
Absolutely. But there again, whoever is asking for a quota for homeless people that we should have 40% at least of them as women, that sounds a little asinine, but it's an inconvenient part of that discussion, isn't
Yeah, and you have to call a spade a spade. Facts don't care about your feelings. We should be able to mention that without, or one should be able to mention that without fearing that. And I'm not talking about you and me. I'm talking about people in general. It should be something to be openly debated why and how that has come about the way it is.
it? Yeah, I think that's kind of the essence of wisdom is that you need to start by acknowledging the facts.
Yeah.
Some of the facts are going to be uncomfortable. We understand that. Some of these issues are going to be contentious. A proportion of the population is going to be highly triggered for stating these things out loud. But how can you ever find viable solutions to any problem unless you first start by acknowledging the
The
reality,
problem. Yeah.
right?
The reality.
Um,
I think there are some trends in modern society that make it possible to, especially social media, I mean, technological trends of the last 20 years that make it possible to discuss those things more openly, even though we have something called cancel culture, where some things that, let me put it differently, people try to deny history or to deny facts. On the one hand, we have that movement, which is specific to the last 5 years or so. And at the same time, there's much more space for people like you and me and many others across the world to name problems by their name and their nature, address them, put them out in the open. There's much more space for that now than there was 50 years ago, let's say. So, in a way, I think we're moving in the right direction where you can at least discuss things more openly than historically was the case. Um, and these kinds of statistics and numbers are something that is certainly fruit and food for thought. Yeah.
yeah, and I think the other part of a productive discussion is essentially that if I come up with, let's say, a position,
Hmm.
um, and you come up with a position that's quite the opposite,
To have a debate.
to have a debate, an open debate, and not
Yeah.
saying, oh, they disagree, and then I want to shame them and never have that debate. And even then, even if we do have a debate, um, and we can agree to disagree, I think the most useful question at that point of time is what evidence would I have to present to you in order for you to change your mind?
Hmm.
And if you then can name what sort of evidence you would need in order to reconsider your position, then we're essentially in a productive state of mind,
Yeah.
even if we disagree. But if you ask somebody like, what evidence do I need to provide to you in order for you to reconsider your position? And your answer is, there's nothing that could change my mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then you're dealing with a low IQ person or a fanatic or somebody who is so ego invested that they know that if they would reconsider their position, their pride, ego, status, social circle would just collapse.
It's living in denial. And denial is not just a river in Africa.
But the other beautiful part of it is that when they studied um, people's, let's say, personal views that also have a touch upon politics,
Hmm.
even though you could, let's say, somebody who is progressive, liberal, socialist, and you could provide them a multitude of evidence why their perspective will not result in a better society than what we have
Yeah.
right now. And you could evidence that very clearly. They still refuse to change their minds. And the question is, why?
Yeah.
Most of the time, it's not necessarily that they don't understand or they're low IQ. it is because their social circle is built upon a certain amount of truths or a certain amount of beliefs that if suddenly they would start switching their position, they would lose their friends.
Public
And
shaming.
exactly. But then the way to make these people reconsider their position is vastly easier if you provide them with a corresponding social circle that they would want to aspire to, then changing their mind and their public, I mean, in the private, in their head, they might change already. They might know, like, yeah, of course, what you're saying is true, but I can't allow my mouth to spit out those words because otherwise my friends or family are going to disown me, right? So when you provide them with an aspirational social circle whereby if they state the obvious and their current friends and social circles start to disown them, they can move to a new one that they find of equal value. Then they'll change their mind in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
And this applies even more to women to whom the social approval is way more important. Guys generally, especially those with the normal T, they are more prone to communicating directly what they think. They have the balls to disagree with the mainstream narrative, and because essentially we know that if I say something out loud that's not popular per se, I'm like, I don't care. You have a problem with that? Okay, bring it. I can defend my position with my mouth and my fist, right?
Hmm.
And women don't have that luxury, vast majority of the time. So therefore, they're more conformist. And
Yeah.
there's also, I mean, I've seen it like through the discussion we even had like this week. It's women want to express the more socially approved opinions, and they're more kind of restrained in their communication. But then, if men are equally restrained, the women perceive these as weak men, right? Because everybody sees that there's an elephant in the room. The women will not say that in order not to hurt somebody's feelings. But when there are men who say, there's a damn elephant in the room, the women are relieved, like, oh, finally somebody with a decent T level who's stating out the obvious. I, as a woman, would not state that, but I'm glad there's a guy who's got balls who can state the obvious. And those guys who are shying away from that, women consider them as wimps. They
Yeah.
don't say it out loud, but they intrinsically know that guy's a wimp. He's a pussy. So it's funny, but very few people actually explain this to young boys and say, look, you need to build character, you need to educate yourself, you need to know how the world operates, and you also need to be physically a force to be reckoned with. Then you can say out these things out loud. You can say, oh, by the way, the Caesar ain't got no clothes on, when everybody else is pretending like, oh, the Caesar new clothes are great.
How does this, how would you, let's come full circle and turn back to how we started our chat with your experience in the military. How would you, because your experience in the military is now some time ago, as in teaching young recruits, how would you, if you could travel back in time to the day, what would you tell them? With, in light of what you just said, in light of basically a summary of these
I think
issues.
the only thing, I mean, in terms of behavior, I wouldn't really change much at all
Hmm.
because to build up a productive, self-sufficient man who's a force to be reckoned with and who can actually accomplish anything in life, I think they need to exercise discipline. And as a kid, somebody needs to be the example for them.
Hmm.
They need to push themselves. They need to get out of their comfort zone. But I think the only thing I would do differently is to first make them do these things. And once they actually perform them, then I would articulate why did we do this, what it benefits, why the mindset and the psychology behind is so important. But I would first make them do that. Go out in the woods and carry a pack of 40 kilos, and then have them sweat their balls off, and then be like tired and exhausted. And then once we get back to the barracks, I'm like, okay, now let's break things down. So that's what I would do. That's what I would also hope that fathers would do that with their sons, right?
Hmm.
To be the example is great, but if you can also articulate why you're doing it, what does it benefit, what's the goal, what's the end goal, that's going to help them understand why, so they don't have to guess and try to read between the lines, right? Um, and in order to have that healthy, I would say, balance in masculinity, places like the military service, I think they serve a purpose. And that's why something also we share from the past is martial arts.
Yeah.
That's also something. It builds your physique. It builds a level of discipline. You have to struggle. You have to put in blood, sweat, and tears to a degree. Mostly sweat, occasionally blood, tears, not really. That's just a
In order of
right.
priority or in order of likelihood.
And
Yeah.
somebody who does martial arts for a prolonged period of time, you can say that even if at the starting point they were weak, they're no longer weak if they do that multiple years. They grow as somebody who's resilient, strong, who's willing and ready to overcome adversity, and they will voluntarily push their comfort zone. A lot of people are so damn lazy nowadays. Voluntarily, they will not do much.
Well, it's all about those responsibilities and rights.
Exactly. And the funny thing is, when you get to start martial arts and you get better at it, it seems as though a lot of times like you're just like grinding and sweating and getting your butt kicked, and sometimes injuries, etc. You're like, okay, what's the end goal here? But without you noticing necessarily that during that progress, that could be invisible to yourself, the character building and getting in shape, all of that, other people notice that. But because you're so kind of caught up in the process and the everyday ground, you don't necessarily see that.
Yeah.
But then one day suddenly you might have, the black belt or something, and you're really skilled. In your own mind, you're still, struggling with the better guys in the gym and the dojo. And you're like, well, it ain't easy. Maybe I gotten a little better, so I don't get my butt whooped to the same degree. But there's always somebody better, somebody more skilled, somebody stronger. There's
Somebody to
always
learn from.
exactly. So the learning never stops. Um, but while you progress there, other people who don't do what you do, they notice like, oh, that guy he's building up something. And only when you accomplish it, let's say you get a black belt, that means a lot of toiling, that means a lot of practice, a lot of workouts. And when you have that black belt, people like they kind of respect it, right?
Mhm.
Why? Because it's not easy to get. This is the same
It's a
reason.
rank.
Exactly. And it's earned.
Yeah.
It's not something like, oh, I feel like a black belt today, so give me one. It's like, no, you gotta earn it,
How does
brother.
that sound so familiar?
It sounds because
I feel like a
yeah,
man today. I feel like a
yeah, yeah,
woman.
yeah. Or in this sense, if you're a man, you have to have your feet planted on the ground, and all the accomplishments you have in life, they need to be real. And if a man is confident, he could fake it, but observe him for an extended period of time. If the dude is confident, that's for real. Why? Because he's probably done enough repetitions to get skills in XYZ. And when you're skilled and you can monetize that and you can get status through that, that's confidence. And the funny thing is, men have to actually accomplish real things in order to become that man and to be confident. Unless you're, one of the very few people who bullshit their life through their life and then get successful for whatever reason, or an anomaly who might be just great looking and super skilled in something without much practice. But a lot of times for women, it's and this is what you see in a bunch of social media is like they perceive that if they feel confident, then it's all good. Like if they look good and they feel confident, that's it. But then we come to the kind of the other part of it, which is all of the, let's say, the structure of society are based on merit, at least in the West, or they should be.
Yeah.
So whenever you let's say you grind your butt in school, then you get a degree. And it's not a participation trophy like I was in class for 4 years, now I have a master's degree. Or I was in class for another 4 years, now I have a doctoral degree. No, you actually have to merit that. Whether it's a black belt, whether it's a degree, whether it's promotion.
A milestone.
Exactly. So
It's only reached through the miles.
yeah, and whenever it's difficult, people respect it. And here we could also take the other segue to What is difficult is respected. What is easy is not respected. What do I mean by this?
What do you
Oh,
mean by that?
I mean in the sense of, and this is again a hot topic.
Because it's all relative, right? Certain things may be relatively easy, relative to something very difficult, may be easy, but still very difficult for others. And it depends on
But
what the actual milestone
yeah,
is.
so the segue I was doing here is it easy for women to have access to sex?
Yes,
Yeah, I agree. I don't
not
I,
not
I, I don't think any sane person would disagree.
not all of them, but invariably much easier than men.
Generally speaking, if a woman was so inclined, could she get sex the same day? Either going to a bar, club, Tinder, whatever.
Yeah,
Exactly. Is it easy for men to get access to sex?
no,
Exactly. Unless you're that top percent of guy who can just like march their way through and right. But it's the difference in terms of the difficulty of having access to sex is it's vast. So when you have a guy who has more access to sex and more women than the average dude, you could call him a player, man whore, whatever. It's difficult because getting women to provide access to sex is hard. You need to put some value on the table. You need to be attractive. You need to have charisma, status, money, whatever, a bunch of stuff. For a woman, she needs to show up, and the schlongs keep slinging around, and that's it. So when you have some of these people who say, "Well, women should not be judged if they have a high body count," it's like, well, for them to get the sex is easy, and if they do a lot of it, it's not respected because it's so easy. And for men, it's not. So a dude who's had sex with 300 women, it's like that's not easy to accomplish. He must be putting something of value to the table in order for these women to be so willing to engage with him.
yeah,
Now, does it mean that men should have sex with 300 women? Of course not. But it's just kind of, it is the opposite side of the same coin.
yeah, yeah,
Imagine if I take an analogy, me at my age and my abilities, I would go to an elementary school and I would go there and I would beat people up, the kids up. And I walk around like, oh, well, that was my prerogative and stuff. And like, why am I not getting respected? Why am I frowned upon? Because I'm a tough dude, I can do whatever. I can just go and beat him up. People look at me like, are you fucking insane? These are kids that are 10 years old. Of course you can beat them up. That's easy. But it's also frowned upon because you're not supposed to do that.
yeah,
This is what I'm thinking when women who sleep around got a high body count, they're like, well, I shouldn't be judged. It's like, yeah, a dude who's beating up kids, it's the same thing. It's so damn easy, but it's also detrimental because you go beat up kids, you end up in jail. You're a woman that sleeps around and has a high body count. All the studies show you have the higher risk of STD, your pair bonding capacity goes down, your production of oxytocin goes down, all of the funky stuff. But saying that out loud is like, oh my God, toxic masculinity. So,
yeah.
but that was a bit of the segue. I've been subjecting myself to, let's call it material online that is discussing these topics.
Why? Why so diplomatic already? I'm not used to that.
Anyway, so I don't know if do you have any particular points that you want to kind of bring up or topics of discussion before we wrap up?
Um, well, let me say that I think the intergender discussion is definitely something we should cover next time
Sure,
in more depth, um, because it's also based on so many subjective experiences.
sure,
On the one hand, on the other, there are these kind of mega trends between men and women, especially the last few years on social media. We mentioned cancel culture, which also has a lot of intergender aspects, issues, topics. So those are things I'd definitely like to cover next time. But I think we kind of um, did a good job covering a whole bunch of issues that maybe in future videos we can also offer our audience more statistics and numbers and because I think both of us in all these different areas that were discussed today, we mention things and come up with certain comparisons, ideas, analyses that come from either sources we've seen or our own judgments and our own interpretation and our own conclusions. Um, so at this stage, I wouldn't say I have anything much to add, but that in future videos again will be coming up with more deep dives, as it were.
Yeah, I think if we made a list of topics we want to touch upon, it wouldn't be hard to imagine extending this to like 5 hours,
Yeah, easily.
no doubt. Um, but in order to save the patience of the audience, whoever might be up for watching all this, it's probably good ending here. We're close to hour and a half, but I do appreciate the talk, and
I
th-
appreciate it too.
this was an idea that came about maybe a week ago.
Spontaneously.
Exactly. And I thought because some people have got photo albums, I thought photo albums that you have a ton of photos, they always capture a moment in a particular context, particular time and place with a certain set of people, right? And I think those have intrinsic value for everybody who's participating in that situation context. And I just thought I'm not a big photo taker, so
I'll do it for you.
you have a
Over the years, I've done it.
right, exactly. But kind of sharing ideas and recording that,
Mm-hmm.
and then being able to share that,
Mm.
that is kind of potentially my way of doing a photo album.
Yeah.
Um, and it's also giving a certain level of insight into two different people that engage in a dialogue. Um, and I already got a couple of guys lined up to just do the same thing of different topics, different experiences, but it's always both a learning experience, sharing experience, and hopefully after such a discussion, both people can leave and say, I got something out of it. Otherwise, why would you do that, right?
Yeah, yeah, true.
So,
We should have a purpose, and that's the cool thing about this.
yeah. Anyways, happy 2024 to everybody, and we'll be back.
Peace.